Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are now ready to begin this session, and I'm extremely excited to be able to introduce to you a panel of really quite extraordinary academic firepower. Now that Victor is here, the audience is going to fall silent. I'll just keep chatting until I feel that you are in the zone. And while you are sitting yourselves, I will introduce the panel, and this will allow the hubbub to die down. To my right, to your left, Lord Layard, or is it Layard? Have I been getting it wrong all these years? Layard. Layard. It's funny how you can mispronounce somebody's name for 20 years. He is the program co-director at the Centre for Economic Performance at the London School of Economics. He was originally a Labour economist in both senses, but in the early 2000s turned his thoughts increasingly to the question of happiness, which is, of course, the subject of our conference. Published Happiness, Lessons from a New Science, a work of synthesis, bringing together scholarship from both sides of the Atlantic. He is one of the regular contributors, indeed co-editors of the World Happiness Report. In 2014, published Thrive, The Power of Evidence-Based Psychological Therapies. And so Richard really crosses the boundary between economics and psychology. I think it's fair to call him one of the pioneers in this field. Sitting next to him is his colleague, George Ward, also at the London School of Economics. And George was really the man who did the heavy lifting on the exceptionally good report, Governance for Happiness, Results from a Worldwide Survey, which you have heard alluded to repeatedly today, and which you've seen slides from. So we'll get a chance to hear more from him about that really first-class piece of research. Next in line is Jeffrey Sachs. I'll probably mispronounce this, but is it the Quetelet Professor of Sustainable Development at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs? He also is an interdisciplinary genius, Professor of Health Policy and Management, also at Columbia School of Public Health. He was for, I think, 14 years, director of the Earth Institute at Columbia. But if you go back to the early part of Jeff's career, he was one of the key players in the economic reforms following the collapse of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, notably in Poland, where he made a huge and important contribution. You may know him better for his more recent books, The End of Poverty, The Price of Civilization. If I listed all the different global boards, panels, commissions that he has either served on or is currently on, the entire session would be consumed. Finally, last but by no means least, my former colleague and friend at Harvard, Steven Pinker, the Johnson Professor of Psychology, somebody who made his reputation working on issues of language. Steve has become known to a very large global public for his most recent books, The Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now. So I promise you, ladies and gentlemen, you have a treat in store from these gentlemen, and I can only apologize for the fact that we are a manel, an all-male panel. I want to make it clear that this was not my doing. With that, I would like to invite Lord Layard to introduce the panel with some opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Oh, so sorry, I got this instead. Okay, thank you. Happiness Now, what a brilliant idea. I am actually, in addition to what Neil kindly said, a co-founder of something called Action for Happiness. And the story is this. We launched it in 2011. We had to appoint a new director. And one of the candidates had searched the web for any other organization in the world that had the word happiness in its title. And the answer that came back on his screen was, your search for happiness has produced no results. Well, we're in a different world now. It's quite extraordinary. For example, the OECD in Paris, Club of Rich Nations, has asked all its member governments to make well-being the goal of government. The EU presidency is thinking about this now in Finland. The New Zealand government has already done so. And of course, it's not a new idea. Here's somebody who would have been absolutely delighted to know what was going on. What he said is, the care of human life and happiness is the only legitimate object of good government. And I can't think of any reason for having a government other than to preserve the life and promote the happiness of the people, provided we also include, of course, the prevention of the misery of the people. So it seems to me the most important idea, fundamentally, of the modern age. And it's wonderful that it's now at last coming to the fore. So here's what I want to say today. I want to say that we need a single measure of happiness to make this work, and I'm suggesting life satisfaction. We already know enough about the causes of that to make it an operational objective. If we're looking for cost-effective policies, mental health would be the number one thing to expand. But we also need change at the individual level and a change of culture. Okay, so what should the government be aiming at? Now, obviously, if you want to have a coherent policy, you have to have a single objective against which you measure the claims of all the different policies. I mean, that's just a simple, logical point. Now, obviously, that could be an index constructed from different bits and pieces. It would have to go further than the so-called dashboard approach, where you just list the effects of policies on lots of different things. That actually has been going on for 50 years. It was called the social indicators approach. It had zero effect on policy. The reason why things have changed in the last 10 years is because of the simple idea of a single objective, what we would call subjective well-being or happiness. And that is what is producing the great new opportunity. And there's no real point taking the dashboard and applying weights, because that requires some policymaker to think that one thing matters more than another. So the ideal approach is by finding a single question, which everybody can agree on is the thing that they want to see maximized. And life satisfaction is, I think, by far the best claimant. I'll give you 4 reasons. First, it's simple. The person who's asked the question knows what it means, and the people who use the question know what the people meant when they answered it. Second, it's democratic in the sense that, unlike these indices, where some professions or policymakers decide what they think is good for people and the way they allocate the weights, the individual is allocating his or her own weights in the way that they answer the question. Third reason, we find that policymakers find it more acceptable to say, yeah, we are aiming at producing a satisfied population, than to say we are aiming at a happy population. There's a lot of problems policymakers have in using that particular formulation. So this is where life satisfaction is good, and I think the public can also accept it. And finally, of course, it's scientifically sound because it's well correlated with all kinds of things that you think it should be correlated with. So this is what we want the government to aim at, maximising life satisfaction of the population, which means that when it's comparing policies, it would always look at the gain in life satisfaction coming from the policy relative to the cost of the policy and choose the policies with the highest values. Now, to do any of this, you have to have an information base. And that's what motivated my colleague George here and me and some others to slave away for some years on data from a whole range of countries to see what were the main causes of well-being over the life course. I'm just going to give you one result. This is British data, but the same applies pretty much in other advanced countries. So here you can see what are the factors that explain the most of the variation, huge variation in happiness across the population, including the prevalence of misery at the bottom end. And you'll see that number one is mental health. That means mental health, has somebody or haven't they been diagnosed with depression or anxiety disorder? That is coming through as much the biggest single explanatory variable. It is actually the biggest single cause of misery in every Western society. And it's time policymakers got round to realizing that if they want to seriously deal with the problems of happiness, they've got to address this. Quality of work is very important. Human relationships involved. Whether you have a family, partnered, very important. Physical health important. And income less important than any of those things. So what we're seeing is that the main factors are human relationships, family, at work, having work and how you are at work and in the community, and your health, especially your mental health. And these, I would like to add, are the same factors that affect whether somebody has very low life satisfaction, i.e. is in what you might call misery. So we need a much wider concept of deprivation. It is appalling when I listen to our parliamentary debates. The assumption is that the main form of deprivation is of the means of living, but of course you are as deprived if you have the inner means to enjoy life, or the family life to enjoy life. So let me just move on rapidly to my pet hobby horse, which is that I do think if you wanted to answer Victor's question, you had, say you had 500 million units of currency to spend, what would be the top priority? I would say in every country, go for better treatment for mental illness. We've got very good treatments for anxiety disorders. Cognitive behavioral therapy produce 50% recovery rate, more or less permanent, in 7 sessions on average. Depression, good treatments again, but more danger of relapse, but relapse rates again halved by these treatments. For child misbehavior, a huge problem in Western society. The training of parents has extraordinary effects, even followed 10 years later on the children of those parents. So here's what's so extraordinary about these treatments. They cost nothing. They cost nothing. Actually, they save more than they cost, because in any country that's got a welfare system, if you enable people to work, you get big savings from a treatment which is not itself very expensive. You also, and this is also very important operationally, you get big savings within the healthcare system, because somebody who has a given physical illness but also is mentally ill takes up 50% more physical healthcare resources than somebody with the same physical illness but without the mental illness. So there are huge payoffs to giving this a completely new priority from the one that it currently has in most of our countries. And we were able to persuade the British government to put in progress a new service, which by 2018 is now treating 600,000 people a year, with 50% recovering after an average of 7 sessions. It's being copied in many parts of the world, and I hope it will be copied in even more parts of the world that are represented here today. So there's an awful lot that policy can do. That's just an example. I must end, though, with the fact that if we want a happier world, we've got to have some change in the way that we behave individually, all of us. We've got to have a society where there's more emphasis on caring for each other and less on getting the most we can for ourselves, which is why we founded this Action for Happiness movement, whose members pledged to try to create the most happiness they can in the way they lead their lives. And they meet regularly in groups. The group begins with a course, and the course has been evaluated in a proper trial and found to raise happiness by more than getting a job or finding a partner. So there are things that can be done at both the policy level and the individual level. And I do believe, that Victor is right, we can have a happier world. We need better policies and we need better people. Let's go for it.
Thank you, Richard. So let's turn now to the specific case of Ukraine, where I think part of what you were aiming to do, George, with this study was to think more about the politics of happiness, though it seems to me that what Richard just said would apply as well to Ukraine as to any country. George, tell us more about the study and perhaps summarize some of its results. I should say that I was hugely impressed by this study when I read it, found it really exciting, and it gave me insights not only into Ukraine, but into many of the other countries that you covered. George.
Thanks. So I prepared a few slides just to show you the main findings of this study, and I'll stand if I may. I feel more comfortable wandering around. So, as we've seen and heard in various of the sessions today, there are a number of countries around the world that have started to put happiness and well-being at the center of their public policy making, and several others are also considering moving in this direction of governance for happiness as well. Now, the science of happiness is actually slightly lagging behind real-world events here. We know from decades of research in psychology and economics all sorts of things about how happiness relates to, say, income, employment, age, education, gender, and so on, but we actually know surprisingly little about how happiness shapes and influences politics. So in this study, we sort of set out to try and close that important gap in our scientific understanding, and the way we tried to do that was to conduct a global survey. We asked large representative samples of people in 15 countries around the world on 6 different continents, a whole range of questions on various aspects of their well-being and happiness, and also about their political attitudes, their beliefs, and also about their behaviors in the political sphere. So, what's the sort of general overall picture of happiness in our survey? Well, we find that much like in the World Happiness Report, which is produced by Jeff Sachs and Richard Layard, among others, and is presented every year at the United Nations, we find that the happiest places in the world are places in Western Europe and also North America, countries like Finland and the USA. But in this study, we try and go beyond that and add in a new temporal dimension to the analysis. We also ask about the future. So among various other questions, we ask people, for example, thinking about your children or future children, do you think they will have a happier life than you or a less happy one? And here we find something really quite different. For example, let's take Ukraine. When we ask about current life satisfaction, about happiness today, Ukraine, in fact, comes 15th out of the 15 countries. But when we ask about the future, it turns out Ukraine is the most optimistic. Over 80% of people here think that the next generation will be happier than this one. And that's a pattern that we find reproduced in various other emerging economies like India, China, and Brazil. But what about the West? Well, here we actually find a much more pessimistic picture. Those who think that the next generation will be happier in these countries are actually in the minority. And when we get all the way down to Germany, that barely goes over 20%. So although these are some of the happiest and some of the richest countries in the world, we actually see quite a deep sense of gloom in the West, a pessimism about the future, and kind of a sense that things may be now as good as they're ever going to be. Of course, as we've heard throughout the day, and as Richard said, a small number of governments are trying to change that. They're trying to place happiness at the heart of policymaking to try and create conditions for people to live happier lives and ensure that each new generation is happier than the last. And one question that I think comes up, and several people have asked me today, and have regularly asked me when I present these kind of findings elsewhere, and that is this: are these countries completely mad? Have they gone crazy? Is this really something that people want their governments to be doing? Will it do them any good? And to try and answer that, we do various things. We start by asking people what I think is a relatively simple, but really quite powerful and important question. And that is, what is the most important thing in your life? What is it that people are trying to achieve? What is it that people want from life? Do they want more income, financial stability, professional success? Or is it something more like happiness, either for themselves or for their children? And when we ask people that, the most frequent response that we get is happiness. And together with health, both mental and physical, this really makes up the majority view in the sample. But even so, even if people want to be happy, does that really mean they want government to play any role in that? Well, we ask people the extent to which they agree or disagree that government should play a role in looking after people's happiness. And we find across all of the countries we study that an overwhelming majority of people say yes, government should play a key role in looking after people's happiness. Even in the USA, which is the country with the largest number of people saying no, government shouldn't have a role, these naysayers, if you like, are still very much in the minority at barely 25%. So it looks like people want to be happy, and they would also like government to play a part. But does that really mean that people in government have any real reason to do this? Do they have any strong incentive to move in the direction of governance for happiness? Well, we ask a fairly standard polling question. We ask people, if a general election were held tomorrow, who would you vote for? And we find actually a strong relationship between people's life satisfaction and also their extent to which they intend to vote for governing parties. There's a clear relationship where happier people are much more likely to vote to re-elect parties for further terms in office. And that's a relationship that holds very strong even when we factor in various other elements of people's lives, like their income, their age, their education, their gender, and so on, in more detailed regression analyses. So it seems from that that governments have real incentives to do something to look after the happiness of the people if they want to get re-elected. And that's something that I've found in other research, looking, for example, at general elections going all the way back to the early 1970s in Europe, that governments are much more likely to stay in power if the people are happy. But you might say, that's all well and good. This idea of governance for happiness sounds great and would have been fantastic, say, 10, 15 years ago. But really, the world has changed in quite fundamental ways. People are now quite angry. Populism is on the rise. And this is no time for a distraction like happiness. Well, I think one of the key findings of this report is that it's really not an either-or question, a focus on populism or a focus on happiness. And in fact, a focus on happiness, or perhaps more specifically, a focus on people's unhappiness, may be one way for mainstream politicians to try to reconnect with disgruntled voters and refocus policymaking on areas of their lives where they have real and concrete issues. Now, when we talk about populism, I think some of us, certainly myself included, are often quite guilty of using the term a little loosely. We talk about populists, populist voters, populist politicians, often in different ways to mean different things. And we wanted to avoid that as much as possible in our survey and be as data-driven as we could be in defining what a populist is. And we asked a whole series of questions about people's beliefs and attitudes, particularly about the way they feel about elites, the establishment, the people, the will of the people. And from that series of questions, the data we gleaned from that, we're able to identify a core cohort of strongly populist people. Now, the size of that populist cohort varies from country to country, but overall we find that around 22% of people are what we call strongly populist, and that rises here in Ukraine to around 35%. But this isn't an issue that's separate from happiness. In fact, we find unhappy people, those experiencing the most misery in their lives, are much more likely to be populist. So focusing attention of policymaking to try and deal with some of those issues, create the conditions for these people to be happier, may be one way to try and stem the tide of populist sentiment as it spreads around the world. And I'll leave you just with one final finding, which I thought was extremely interesting and certainly surprised me, and that is when we asked people the extent to which they agreed that government should play a role in looking after people's happiness, we actually found the strongest support for that came from these populists in the populist cohort. So what I take from that piece of data is this. These people are certainly very anti-establishment, very anti-elite in the way they think about the world, but they're not necessarily anti-politics or anti-government per se. What the data seems to suggest is that they're very unhappy with the way their lives are going at the moment, but they would like, and perhaps even are demanding, that government do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, George. I think what we'll do is gradually mutate this into more of a discussion about the findings at the general level and the specific level. And I thought I might go to you first, Jeff. Much of your recent career has, I think, been focused on improving the material conditions of people in the poorest countries of the world and tackling problems, malaria, that are absolutely fundamental to well-being in its most basic sense, prolonging life, avoiding children dying. Does this translate in your mind into a strategy for the poorest countries? Or is the reality that in the poorest countries of the world, you get to worry about happiness once you've solved the most basic survival questions?
I wouldn't even make the distinction, because when you're very poor, having the basic means to stay alive makes you happier. So it is true that people who are in desperate straits can't be happy. They can't be with equanimity, with the balance of life. And it's interesting, of course, Aristotle, who got us started on all of this, the great philosopher 2,300 years ago, who first wrote about happiness and politics, said that you need a basic condition of life to even have a chance to be happy. You need a living standard that is acceptable. So it's not surprising that for the poorest people in the world, enough food to eat, safe water, access to health are surely the most important things in the world. But they're not the only things in the world, and you need government to deliver the well-being. And I think the most important slide that I would take from your presentation just now is that people sense we do need and want government to help provide happiness for us. And it's interesting, even in the United States, which is the libertarian or free market place in the world, overwhelmingly people say, yes, of course, government should help to raise our happiness. When I go back to the start of this discussion 2,000 years ago, Aristotle wrote 2 books together. One was called The Ethics, and that is how to live a good life. It was kind of good advice to his son, actually, Nicomachus. And the other book, which went along with it, was The Politics. Because for Aristotle, politics was, of course, the subject of how a community how the polis, the city, could achieve happiness. Well, I think overwhelmingly around the world we want governments to perform better. And we expect and we know that we need governments to be promoting happiness. But there are two big obstacles, at least. One is that they have no idea what that means in most cases. So most of our governments have never thought about this question very hard. They don't even understand that it's a real issue. They don't understand that things can be measured. They don't understand that there are changes that could make a big difference in people's lives. Of course, the other problem is that in most countries, starting with mine, they don't care. The politicians are corrupt. And by the way, if you want a model of corruption these days, it's the United States, unfortunately. That's how you end up with Donald Trump as president. Because we have lost our politics of the good. It's all money from morning till night in America now. $8 billion of campaign financing each cycle. So there's no public good anymore. And this is important to understand, because what happened in the United States is we became very rich and more unhappy. And this is really key to understanding what went wrong in the most powerful country in the world. Because we reached $65,000 per person income, but the happiness is collapsing. Suicide rates are soaring, epidemic rates are soaring, anxiety rates are soaring. What is all that money for if there's no decency of life? And of course, you think Donald Trump is reading the surveys of happiness? He's our #1 unhappiness factor right now. So this is a really important practical message, that chasing money is not going to do it, except when you're very poor, of course, meeting basic needs without question. But thinking about what makes for a good society, what makes people gain trust, how government, if it's untrustworthy, as so many of our governments are, is going to lead to unhappiness for people, and how you can hold governments accountable by looking at the measurement. In Ukraine, Ukraine ranks 133rd in the world in happiness. Now you have a new president. We're hoping it's going to give a boost. But this is a country that needs some happiness. Of course, one of the reasons has been a lot of corruption and government that has not been able to solve the problems, and the very real geopolitical problems that this country faces. You are in the middle of difficulty, and you know it very well. So this is a very real phenomenon. But I want to see Ukraine rise in the list. And there are a lot of practical things that can be done to help Ukraine rise in the list of happiness. And it is exciting that there's optimism about the future. And I think the key for government is to make that optimism proved right, and to study how to do that seriously, because governments need to think also. It's not a game. Politics should not be a game. It should be a rational process. It's not, but it should be. And if it is that way, we'll get much better results.
Thank you, Jeff. I want to turn to Steve Pinker now and ask if we can reconcile what Jeff Sachs just said about the United States with what you said earlier about there essentially being a pretty good correlation between rising incomes and rising happiness. Is the US some kind of quirky exception to your story?
Yeah, the United States is an outlier among affluent Western democracies in just about every way. It is a relatively happy country. I think in the World Happiness Report it comes in at around 12, something like that, now 20. So it certainly punches below its wealth, although it's still a relatively happy country. It has a higher rate of violent crime by a large measure, poorer health measures, poorer performance on the PISA tests of international scholastic achievement. Still in the top 10 or 20, but not as high as it should be given its wealth. And there are a lot of explanations. I don't think any of them is particularly compelling. I think it would be an exaggeration, though, to say that the American suicide rate is soaring. It hit a low point in 1999, and it's been creeping back up. But it is, I think it's just gone back to where it was in the 1980s, and it was far worse in earlier decades. Likewise, American happiness, at least according to the General Social Survey, the percentage of people who say that they're very happy has drifted a little bit downward, but the percentage that are either very happy or somewhat happy is pretty flat over about 70 years. Now, that is surprising given that the United States GDP per capita has certainly gone up in 70 years. But again, the American happiness level and GDP was pretty high to begin with, and so there may be a ceiling as to how much higher it could have gotten, which leads me to wonder whether some of the paradoxical finding of the negative correlation between current happiness and optimism for the future might come from the fact that if you're in a pretty unhappy country, it's very easy to imagine how your kids could be happier. But if you're in the top 10 or 15 or even 20, it may be harder to imagine how much happier your kids could be. But anyway, just to get back to your question, the United States is something of an outlier. In the rest of the world, suicide rates have been decreasing by a lot, by about 40% over the last 20 years. Rates of mental health, using as constant a yardstick as we can find, seem to be pretty flat over 20 years. But the United States is doing not bad, but not as well as you would expect.
Thanks, Steve. Listen, we've got, according to the clock, just 12 minutes left. So now we go to a more lightning round phase where you have to do academic, non-academic answers. Imagine we're on TV. Richard, when people say, I want government to make me happy, I don't think they have in mind a significant improvement in mental health care. Is there a disconnect between what people are expecting from government and what government can actually deliver? And if so, what do we do about it?
I think there is some, and I think that's based on the idea that people have about what government could deliver. But it seems to me very important now that we know the huge importance of human relationships and so on, and mental health, that we use the science that we have to provide services which people may or may not, going back to your previous remarks, choose to use. It's not forcing anybody to do anything. We're offering people support which they desperately need. And I'm sure every single person here knows people who are mentally ill and who are desperate and don't know what the hell to do about it. And I think that if we're now getting politicians in Britain who are saying, yes, actually, the party I belong to, the British Labour Party, our leader has put mental health as a top priority. Because in the surgeries where people go and see their members of parliament, these are the things that people say, what on earth can we do about this? And people will respond once it's understood that the government can do things to help people with their family life and their mental health.
Question for George following up from that. It strikes me, though you don't spell it out in the report, that there's a big danger of excessively high expectations in Ukraine today. And that going from being the most gloomy people in the survey to expecting things to get massively better in the next 5 years and be even better for their kids, that strikes me as really setting the country up for disappointment. Do you worry that this belief that government can deliver happiness, and particularly this new government, is fraught with peril? I mean, what happens to the populists if it doesn't quite work out that way in a relatively short time frame?
Well, I mean, it's great that Ukrainians are so optimistic, and hopefully the new government will sort of take up this mantle and try and improve happiness as much as possible. but expectations are sky high, and that really means they have to deliver. If they don't deliver, they're likely to be voted out of office. We've seen in the data that when people are unhappy, they're very keen to vote for opposition parties. And we find, so that what I showed you here on the slides was populist attitudes, the relationship between beliefs and happiness. We also looked at populist voting, and we found that when sort of mainstream governments are in power and populists are in opposition, they really attract a lot of unhappy voters to their cause, and they sort of get into office on the back of unhappy people. But once populists are in power, things really revert back to this original story of happier people vote to re-elect incumbents. So populists really do have to deliver, otherwise they're out. I mean, and that's a tough ask, particularly if you start from a relatively low point, but with high expectations, they've got to really follow through. Luckily, as Richard was saying, there's a huge amount that can be done that's been tested sort of and has a large evidence base in other countries. So certainly they can try, but if people have sky high expectations, they're going to be disappointed. But let's hope they can sort of use international best practice and really have a good go of it.
Jeff, one of the things that may have been said before you got here was that there had been experiments in the 20th century with governments that promised to deliver happiness to the people, and those had not necessarily turned out very well. And the photograph we saw from Chernobyl at lunch made the point rather more beautifully than anything I could say. I worry a little bit that this notion government can make you happy is tapping into some half-buried memory of Soviet promises or promises of other utopian systems in the mid-20th century. You saw the kind of wreckage, the economic wreckage that communism left in Central and Eastern Europe. Can we somehow recalibrate this so that we don't repeat those utopian mistakes of the 20th century?
Yeah, look, I don't think this is at all about utopia or about crazy expectations. This is about decency, and it's about steering a knowledgeable and decent course for government. One ideology is, well, we can't have government, it's always dangerous. This is the libertarian U.S. idea of some. And you end up with no government and no society that functions decently. We need government, everybody agrees on that. The question is how it should act. And the main point here is that it should look at more things than the quarterly national production index, which is what governments look at right now, for example. In the United States, 99% of our reporting is, will the gross national product rise by 2.4% or 2.5%? Absolutely nothing depends on this, by the way. But when life expectancy goes down, which it has in the last 2 years, it is not even reported in the major newspapers. When unhappiness goes down, as it has, it's not even reported. When people are suffering, it's not reported. So the real issue here is a little bit how we steer and how we think about the behavior of government. I don't think this is about utopia or promising crazy remaking of humanity. It's a lot more practical than that. And it is very pragmatic, which is how can we make a more decent society? By the way, Ukraine could have a very, very bright future. It's not all in Ukraine's hands. We need some geopolitical solutions, which are not impossible. But with those solutions, a lot else would follow. And with some decency of government and a little bit better geopolitics, Ukraine would soar. This morning, I was on a video conference with Poland because it was the 30th anniversary of my engagement as advisor to Poland. And in Poland, they had 30 very good years, by the way. And Poland was about 30% of the income per person of Germany 30 years ago. Now it's 65%. It's closed the gap. Nothing miraculous, but it was peace, security, membership in Europe, decency. And so this is, of course, within Ukraine's future. And that is why the optimism is absolutely realistic.
Steve, I provocatively suggested that the happiness agenda might turn out to be partly a conservative agenda, because it would turn out that family and community and social capital were important determinants of happiness, not things that government can provide, things that, in fact, government can undermine. What's your take on that?
Well, there's a trade-off between, there can be a trade-off between freedom and happiness. And one of the reasons I began sharing some of your skepticism of whether government should aim to increase happiness is that one could imagine many ways in which a government could intervene paternalistically in ways that we could resist. So relationships certainly are an important component to happiness, but I don't think I would want the government telling me who I should marry, how I should spend my time, even if one could imagine that on average it might increase my happiness, simply because government isn't magic. Governments have specific powers. They've got a police force, they've got an army, they can tax, but they can't directly raise people's happiness. And there would be, as you note, a danger if they tried to directly. One danger would be that people vary, and what makes one person happy might not make another person happy. The other is there's a trade-off, can be a trade-off between freedom and happiness. Part of freedom is the freedom to screw up your own life, and part of the problem is limited knowledge. Even with the best understanding of happiness, we don't really have an algorithm or a formula, and if government was empowered to use the current theory as to what makes people happy, one could imagine some disastrous consequences. On the other hand, I thought you went too far, and I
never do that.
And I would restate the problem in a way that would avoid the danger of paternalism leading to totalitarianism, but would still recognize governments have to have some kind of goal. Why do they exist? Why do they have a police force? Why do they tax people? I'm not sure that it's an accurate characterization of the communist regimes of the mid-20th century to say that they were in the business of leading to the greatest happiness for the greatest number. I think probably is closer to advancing the historical dialectic leading to class struggle and the dictatorship of the proletariat. So I'm not sure you could blame the Gulag and the Great Leap Forward on the drive for greater happiness. I think to square this difference, one could say that all governments do try to provide public goods. That is the libertarian fantasy of the government that does nothing but provide security and enforce contracts doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Maybe it could exist, but we have never seen one in an advanced country. So governments are always in the business of doing something more. One could state the more precise statement of the idea: should governments pick the public goods such as mental health, such as green space, such as public transportation, that in turn lead to increases in subjective well-being? And so instead of empowering government to raise people's happiness directly, which is probably impossible and undesirable, you could say of the government, things that the government is empowered to do, should it select and prioritize them by how much they increase well-being? And I think that is indeed defensible.
And that indeed is a lot like your argument, Richard. We've been granted 5 extra minutes of happiness. I want to use those minutes to take at least one question from the audience, because it seems to me that we've kind of pontificated and we need to get some feedback. So, Richard, you had a quick comment, and then we'll go to.
I just wanted to say
audience.
that the biggest single category of crime in Britain is domestic violence. Now, the way to deal with that is not to put people in prison. The way to deal with that is to offer couples in conflict well evidence-based therapies that will bring them out of the conflict. So we're talking all the time when we say behavior matters, not telling people how to behave, that in a way is the repressive conservative agenda. The liberal agenda is to offer them support for improving their ways of living.
And I think I can agree with that. We have a question somewhere, I think from over there, from an audience member. Oh, I was so hoping it would be a woman. Never mind.
Hi. My name is Artem Shaip of Professional Government Association of Ukraine. I have a question regarding the data you provided on the future of one's children and the perception of their future happiness. And I think there is one important data point which is missing in this survey, and forgive me if I'm wrong. The question related to the willingness to work very hard in order for this dream for the children to come true. Was there such a question?
People's personal willingness. We didn't ask a question about that, no.
A good question to ask.
An excellent question, I would say. I rather inferred that they were expecting the government to sort it out, and that was what worried me most in the survey.
I think it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the science of happiness, I think. It's about creating the conditions, as we've sort of all discussed, and I think come to a consensus. So, but there certainly would have been a great question. Richard?
Do you want to come in, Richard, or should we try and sneak in another question?
I just wanted to comment on your remarks this morning.
Go on.
I mean, perhaps the most vivid finding of all happiness research is that freedom advances human happiness and unfreedom reduces it. So the idea that the happiness agenda is bad for freedom is completely wrong, and the opposite is true.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most important things that is, in fact, in your survey, because it's one of the questions that you ask.
We do ask.
Towards the end about freedom. Do you want to just briefly say something about that?
Yes. In the World Happiness Report, there is an analysis each year of the factors which influence the variation of happiness across countries. And the big factors are freedom, social support, corruption, health, generosity, and income.
Have we time for one more question? Perhaps from a female member of the audience? Yes, there is in fact a lady over here. Can we get a microphone right? There's one there. Yes, please.
I'm Olga Jugan, Institute of International Relations, and I have such a question. What do you think, what is the role of money in global happiness, and maybe the relations about money and happiness? Because it is a common thing that most happier countries, they have the global capital, and most, I don't know how to explain it,
Well, this actually gives me a chance to ask about one specific country which hasn't come up but is so huge that it really should, and that's India. Because India seems to be a paradox at the moment. It's achieving rapid economic growth, but happiness has gone down according to the most recent surveys. And I wonder if any of the happiness experts on the panel can help us think about that very contradictory outcome.
I think the main point is that income is a factor in well-being, certainly. And when you're very poor, it's an overwhelming factor because it signifies the ability to meet basic needs. As you get richer, it remains a factor, but of less and less importance. And it's only one of the factors of well-being. Family life, social networks, peace, security, honesty of government, mental health, physical health, they're all important. And if you just aim either as an individual or as a society for income, you end up in a very disturbed situation. So my country is so focused on money, it has put aside almost everything else. And we are absolutely becoming less and less happy and more unstable. A good society of balance like your Scandinavian neighbors who are at the very top of the list. They're not so rich, but they're very prosperous. But they're paying a lot of attention to other social goods, like leisure time, like social networks, like equality, and like honesty of government. So the focus on income is so easy to exaggerate. That's the problem. And true for individuals too. Psychologists have found for 50 years that individuals who say money's really important to me are less happy than those who have a more balanced life.
Richard, a final word from you, and then I suspect we're all out of time.
I will just give you two figures. In most countries, the difference in income, the whole inequality of income, explains not more than 1% of the variation in happiness. There's one country where it's different, and that's the United States, and it's 2% in the United States. But as Jeff says, there's just a lot more to life than income, and it's striking the balance, which is what it's all about.
Well, I think we have now reached that point in the proceedings when I need to tell you what comes next. And the answer is dinner, often a source of happiness. And to make it even more happy or happier, I'm proud and pleased to announce that there will be not only a special guest, that's almost become a tradition, Victor, but also a special surprise, it says here. So it only remains for me to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a very happy-making session.
Cheers. Thanks, Jeff.